Hello family, it's African Esquire and I'm here with another video. This morning I was on the internet and I happened to run across an article on Huffington Post that I thought was very interesting and I thought was so relevant to right now with things that are going on, in particular with the organization Federation of African Liberation. We are calling for a boycott of all French products, and not just with that though, but also things that are happening in the news, such as people boycotting Starbucks, people boycotting Waffle House. Previously, people were boycotting H&M. Now, this article, the title of the article is "Your Boycott Might Fail, but You Should Do It Anyways," and it's written by someone named Brandon Hogan, who is an assistant professor of philosophy at Howard University. And you might think that I'm going to go through this article and say, yeah, exactly. Your boycott might fail, but you should do it anyway. It's a great message. But actually, I thought it was a very weak article, especially for how it framed the issue of boycotting. The way that I think he framed it was the way that most liberals tend to approach the idea of boycotting, and that is in a reactionary way. It's not very strategic. It's not seen as a means to an end, really, but it's just seen to a means in itself. The means in itself in that situation would be, I'm offended that your corporation did this, and so I want to resolve that being offended by doing something that's going to hurt you, and also be clear to the world that I'm offended that you did this. Now, this does not actually change the corporation, and it does not actually change the situation that made you offended, but it does give you a release. It makes you feel better. It makes you feel like you did something to the people who hurt you, and because of that, it's seen as a means to, it's seen as an end to itself, even though it's not a means to an end. The ultimate end, of course, would be ending discrimination and just racist practices by corporations. That would be the ultimate end, but I'm going to actually go through the article and I'm going to read certain sections of it. And I want to talk about how that frame of mind is actually very negative for African people around the world whenever we're faced with issues and faced with controversies. That if our frame of mind is to boycott just so that we can make it clear to the world this is how we feel about things, and not actually have a strategic reason for boycotting, first of all, but actually be willing to carry that out to the end, then no, you should not be boycotting. You should actually be focusing on something that's actually going to bring about meaningful results. Instead of wasting time on things that actually won't bring meaningful results, why don't you spend time on things that actually could change the world around you? So, and after I also go through the article, I want to just briefly talk about the Togo boycott, the French boycott that the FAL is doing as a means of protest, not really just protesting, but really of fighting to cripple the regime and the corrupt regime in Togo, and doing so by attacking one of the biggest supporters of the regime, which is France. And by attacking France and their economy, trying to assist our people in Togo to ultimately rid themselves of this colonialist system that is happening there and really all over Africa. But that is one of the more extreme examples as far as how France carries out certain policies and how it does certain things in Africa. So let's just go through the article really quickly. So Brandon Hogan starts off as saying, within the last year, people have called for a boycott of the clothing store H&M over a racist ad campaign, and Uber over its CEO's ties to the Trump administration. More recently, some have called for a boycott of Waffle House in response to the violent arrest of a black woman at the chain on Sunday. These calls raise ethical questions for progressive consumers. Starbucks coffee is convenient. H&M sells inexpensive clothing, and Uber is sometimes the cheapest ride option, and a lot of people love the food at Waffle House. Given that boycotting is personally inconvenient and that many demonstrations don't often yield lasting, tangible results, is there any reason for you, a progressive individual, to participate? Which is a question I think that is legitimate for how boycotting is used in 2018. A lot of the things, so Starbucks is on almost every corner if you go to like a downtown metropolitan place. And if you're someone that buys their coffee, me personally, I think they're kind of too expensive and I don't really think it's that good to even pay that money. But if you're someone who wants to do that, who likes their coffee, it might be inconvenient to go to another shop down the street, I suppose. And H&M does sell cheap clothing, although I never really liked their cheap clothing. I just thought like it was too cheap and too much for their cheapness, but that's just me. And obviously most people use Uber and Waffle House. I live up north, so I don't really see too many of those, but they're pretty popular, especially in the South. So he goes on to say, paradigmatically, a boycott aims to change corporate behavior by impacting a company's bottom line. By this measure, most boycotts fail miserably. We are creatures of habit. Even if we decide to boycott Starbucks, we can effortlessly fall back into the habit of getting a tall roast before work. Now, my answer to that would be, number one, if it's so easy for people to go back to that product that they're supposed to be boycotting, I would believe that the reason what they were boycotting was not an urgent reason enough for them to identify that product as being a means of their oppression. So, for example, if you're boycotting Starbucks because, oh, I don't like how they treated the customers that were in the store, because of that, I'm going to boycott them. As opposed to if you're boycotting a company or an industry that you know plays a direct role in something that is actually killing your community. So we could use the example of prison labors. So let's say you're someone who really cares about the prison industrial complex and the fact that many African people are in prison and that they're being used for free labor to pay for products that are being distributed to consumers like you and I. And let's say it's really personal to you and that you not only care about this because our people are in these prison facilities, but maybe you have a family member that's a victim of this. Maybe you have a cousin. Maybe you know someone who's actually being subjected to free labor for these corporations, and these corporations are profiting off of the labor of your people. And if you're such a person and have such conviction, I would like to believe that conviction is more important than getting a Starbucks coffee. If or let's say Starbucks was that company, I would like to believe that would be more important to you than getting a caffeine fix. However, if you're casually boycotting, if you're boycotting just to say, okay, well, I don't like the way that you treat me, then yeah, you might go back to that product. You might wait a little bit of time and then go back to that product. But that's to say that the reason for your boycotting initially obviously wasn't that urgent. If you have an urgent sense of this is my livelihood, this is something that has to do with my people, this is something that could kill me, this is something that could kill my family, I would like to think that you can keep walking past Starbucks and not stop to get a coffee. So that's one point I will make, is that I think that a lot of the boycotts that are being done today, they're being done out of a reactionary out of a reactionary feeling, but not necessarily because we are convinced in our heart of heart and our mind of minds that this is the particular thing that's going to end our oppression. I believe that we know that when we boycott these companies, yes, we're getting our aggression out. Yes, we're making a stance against what they did, but we're not making a stance against their position over us. And if they have position over us to discriminate, then that discrimination is going to happen. That's just the way it is. Any corporation that is in the position to discriminate and to oppress you, that corporation is going to do so because they have the ability to do so. Even if it's not, Starbucks is the type of company, they have so many subsidiaries. I promise you, one of them is going to act as so because they have the ability to do so. They have the ability to racially profile you because they own these large chain of businesses. So think about that. Is this something that I believe in, or am I doing this to release energy? If you're doing this to release energy, you're probably not convinced that this is something that's going to end your oppression. So I also want to say that, let me read a little further. So he says, further, in many cases, potential boycotters would not have purchased the company's product under any circumstance. For instance, I can't afford a Brooks Brothers suit, so if I were to publicly denounce the brand, that would not affect its products. And this is where I will say that that's because your strategy is an individual strategy. You're trying to protest this brand by more so appealing to people who are either like you or similarly situated as you. So me, I'm sure I can. I don't even know how much a Brooks Brothers thing is. I don't never shop there. I'm sure it's expensive, and I'm sure that's not something that I would buy. However, there are plenty of African people, and we have to understand, our people are huge consumers. I don't care if you're in America, if you're in Africa. We are people who are heavily marketed to. There is a good significant amount of our people who live in the hood and they might, on paper, they might seem like they're not doing well, but actually they have name brand things. They have Gucci, they have Dolce & Gabbana. But even if that weren't the case, when you look at people who are like celebrities, look at the athletes, look at the entertainers, Black people, we are very heavily concentrated in the entertainment industry. I think we're probably overrepresented when you think about how many rappers, singers, basketball players, football players were definitely overrepresented inside of those fields. So when you not just say, okay, I'm going to stop doing this, but when you make a direct appeal to the people who can afford to actually buy these products, then it becomes more important. And not only that, more than likely, these people have liberal friends or whatever who are going to say, oh, that's the reason you're not buying this product? Okay, let me also step away from it. I think African people, we tend to discard the influence of celebrities, but understand that while many of them don't represent us, if they have the heart, if their heart is with the community, they are a very powerful weapon against white supremacy because they represent so much as far as consumerism. They represent so much as far as influencing others to buy certain things. So if you can get a celebrity or an athlete, someone, or just someone who's just rich and who's not afraid to combat white supremacy, if you can get one of those people to back your boycott, you're going to be a lot more effective. So let's go on a little more. He says, but surely some boycotts are successful, right? The Montgomery bus boycott is heralded as a success because many people believe it brought an end to bus segregation in Alabama. But causation is a tricky thing. Did bus segregation end because of the boycott? Alabama segregation laws were ruled unconstitutional in Browder versus Gale, a federal lawsuit pursued by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Federal courts have decided this case absent any could have decided this case absent any boycott. When he made this statement, this shows that he doesn't understand how Supreme Court decisions are raised, and I will say particularly and always the case when it comes to race. Whenever a Supreme Court decision comes into the Supreme Court, it has to do with race all the time. And this is almost usually the case, but when it has to do with race, it's always going to be the case. That thing did not get there spontaneously. It gets there because of the political landscape that exists at the time that the Supreme Court case is being decided. So, for example, Brown versus Board of Education, that was actually a string of protests. It was a string of smaller court decisions that were leading up to Brown versus Board of Education. The other thing that was happening in the political landscape was the United States was what we call the Red Scare, McCarthyism. The United States was panicking in regard to communism, and they're trying to do whatever they can to dissuade people from becoming communists, and understanding that a lot of people who were in the Black community were starting to sympathize with socialist and communism because of the message, which is that the people should own the means of production. Because of that, the United States had to do something to essentially quell the dissent that was going on at that time. So it wasn't just like these decisions just come out of nowhere. These decisions are always motivated by something that's happening on the groundwork. So yes, the Montgomery boycott absolutely did lead to bus desegregation. The case didn't just pop out of nowhere. I promise you, had this not been happening, had the national conscience not been awakened by this huge demonstration that actually was a success and that people actually did it, and they walked away from getting a ride, and some of them walked to work, some of them were carpooling. They were greatly inconvenienced by this protest, by the way, but it worked. And so to say that, do we know that it's actually what caused the bus desegregation? Yes, we do know that. So he goes on to quote someone named Daniel Dearmeer, and I hope I pronounced the name right. And this is someone, I looked him up because he's like a political scientist or professor or something. He wrote for Harvard Business Review what he felt are the features of a successful boycott. Now, I'm curious to know who he is and what makes him know what makes a boycott successful or not. But, regardless, we'll read his comment. So first he says that consumers must care passionately about the issue that inspires the boycott. Second, it must be easy to participate in the boycott. For instance, it's easy to boycott a fast food restaurant Harder to boycott a service you may use every day, like transportation. Third, and the most essential element of a successful boycott is media attention. The more time national media outlets spend covering a boycott, the more successful it will be. This is, I think, a pretty truthful statement. However, I will emphasize that I feel like the first point is more important than the second point. So as he said, it has to be easy to participate in a boycott. I think if the boycott is of something that is killing your people and you waking your people up to the fact that this thing is going to kill you if you do not boycott it, I think that will outweigh the fact that it's inconvenient. That's just my personal opinion. So many of our ancestors, we have a long history of us walking away from things when we realized that this was going to kill us. When it came to the lynchings, when it came to churches being bombed, whenever you realize that this system is doing things to hurt you, doing things to kill you, and you could do something to possibly hurt the system and stop the system, we will back up something even if it's inconvenient. The key is, though, waking our people up to the fact that this is happening. This is going to be, I think, one of the biggest challenges as far as the boycott for France that the FAO is doing, because we have to be awakened to colonialism, what colonialism is, and how Neo-colonialism specifically, and how it is not just destroying Africa, but destroying the entire African diaspora. So without us being awakened to that and understanding that these markets that are created are essentially directly related to us being victims of genocide, really, if we don't have that connection in our mind to what's going on, then we will never be able to fully give up certain things and fully walk away from certain things that are going to inconvenience us. So I'm going to go on. He says about the three things that were listed. He says, getting these and other stars to align in a single boycott is difficult. Thus, many boycotts die off before any significant change is made. If the sole aim of the practice is changing corporate behavior, it seems rational then to avoid boycotting, opting instead for convenience. But I believe at least some boycott demonstrations serve an expressive function. They allow us to say something about our values, even if they don't change any business practices. So this is a lot in this paragraph, so I'm going to break it up a little bit. So when he says getting the stars to align in a single boycott is difficult. Yes, it is difficult when you're not strategic. So if you're going to pick something that is meaningless, like, Starbucks coffee, I don't think most people are so compelled, if you are a Starbucks lover, that 5 years from now, even if the company doesn't do anything different, you're not going to be drinking their coffee. So if you're not getting something that people really care about, and it is inconvenient, and it's not getting media coverage, then yeah, your boycott's going to fail. That is why you have to be very strategic from the start. You have to get something that people absolutely care about. You have to get something that people realize is essentially going to end their livelihood if they do not put it down. You know, the perfect example we should be looking at is what happened with the NFL. All those patrons, those white patrons who decided that they would no longer watch the NFL, and then you had all the black patrons that said that they were no longer going to watch the NFL. And we know who won as between the white and the black ones, because the black ones wanted Colin Kaepernick to be reinstated and wanted to support the ones who were the African people who were taking a knee, and their allies who were taking a knee to protest police brutality. We know that most of the people who started out boycotting, in the end, they've actually went back to watching the NFL. However, a lot of those white patrons, they were not watching it if people were kneeling. And they were so convinced that this, and you have to understand, and it might seem like, well, why were they so passionate? But when you have something so, to disrespect their flag is essentially a threat to their entire existence. Because when you're disrespecting the flag, you're disrespecting what has been done with that flag. You're disrespecting the entire civilization that has been formed around that flag, and you're calling it into question, a moral question. And if we bring a moral question to what has been done with the American flag in the name of the American flag, then we're going to have serious problems for people who feel a certain way about maintaining their status and maintaining their positions in this world. So it's understandable why they felt it was so passionate to defend that flag. What's not understandable is why some of us started off and then some of us went right back to it. But again, the question is, did you believe in the beginning that this was about you trying to preserve your livelihood, or were you simply upset for Cat? Did you really connect this to police brutality, or were you upset with how the white man was treating Cat? Two very different things. So he says the sole aim of the practice of boycotting is changing corporate behavior. That should not be your aim of boycotting, changing corporate behavior, because you have to understand, in capitalism, corporate behavior is always going to be doing whatever is necessary to maximize profits. So if it will maximize profits for Starbucks to have a day of racial diversity training, they will do it. If it will maximize profits for Starbucks to not do that and let everything run however they want it to run, they will do it. It's not about you. That's what you have to understand. They'll do whatever they have to do to get to their bottom line, which is their dollar. So if you're trying to change corporate behavior in that type of way, I would question what exactly you're trying to change. Are you trying to change the fact that they own the means of production and they can do these things? Because that should be what you should really be upset about. It shouldn't be that there are individuals who are practicing racism. It should be that those people are in a position to practice that in the first place. And then when he says that boycotting allows us to say something about our values, even if they don't change any business practices. So this is very alarming, because to say that it's important just to say something about your values, even if it actually doesn't change what actually happens, understand that this is very much symbolism. And Black people were very obsessed with symbolism. We think as long as we march and as long as we speak up about something, that's going to be all that we need as far as helping us in the long run. However, all symbolism really does is it makes you feel good in the short run. So my question is, number one, don't you know that they already know your values in this regard? So we'll go to Starbucks. The values of the Black people in Starbucks was that we want to be able to have the same luxury of entering Starbucks and exiting Starbucks without being racially discriminated. Do you think they do not know that already? You should know that they do know that already, and that is essentially common sense. I mean, it's common sense that most African people want to be treated the same that everyone else is treated. Now, since they know that, is it going to change anything to restate that? Is them knowing your values going to change your reality at all? Has it changed the reality of a lot of people? The fact that our long history of slavery, of colonialism, has people knowing our values changed anything? And then think about this. A lot of them say that they have the same values. I'm sure if you look at Starbucks company policy, you're going to see something that's anti-racist. In America, whenever you look at the different treaties that have been signed, the different conventions that have taken place, you're going to see a very different America in words than you did in practice. And the reason is because when values collide with monetary interests, your values, no one really cares. It's always going to be about the monetary interest. And that is the biggest thing to remember in capitalism. It's not really about morals. It's about getting the most out of your dollar and doing whatever is necessary to do that. And a lot of these are corrupt practices, especially when we're talking about the things that are happening as far as companies taking advantage of people in Africa by making deals with their leaders. So last thing he says is, but what if your boycott is not heard by corporations? Successful large-scale boycotts garner significant media attention, but why should one participate in a small-scale boycott that is unlikely to have an economic impact or to be heard by the offending corporation? I, for example, refused to shop at a clothing store, Billy Reed. The last time I visited its Georgetown location, a sales associate followed me and my companion around the store, attempting to annoy us until we left. I personally hate Billy Reed, but the company has no idea. wouldn't it be more rational for me to abandon the boycott? Now, what my answer to you would be, wouldn't the natural solution be to, instead of thinking about having an individual boycott, to take that money and put it into a black business that's going to actually treat you right, that's not going to follow you around the store, and that's not going to discriminate against you? To me, that's the ultimate thing. As far as having an individual thing, yes, there are things that I personally will not support. I don't know if I would call that a boycott because I'm not necessarily getting other people to back me up with it. But the meaningful thing to do, I think, in that situation is to replace those products that we just disagree with for whatever reason, or times where we have been victims of racial discrimination, to essentially put that money into somewhere else. To me, that is the ultimate spit in the face, really, of white supremacy. So now I want to tell y'all what I think would make a strategic boycott, and in particular why I think the FAL's boycotting France is going to be strategic. And if we can get behind it and educate ourselves on the issue of colonialism, I do believe that it will work. Now, just a recap, and I will have a full video where I completely talk about the boycott. I believe I'll be publishing it on Monday the 1st. But as of right now, I'm going to just talk about some of the strategy behind it. Now, the boycott, again, is we are calling on people of African descent throughout the world to completely boycott any products that are exports of France. And that means a number of products, including L'Oreal, Danone, Danone, they have the yogurt, Louis Vuitton, just a number of French products, and we have them listed on our Facebook group. But I'm going to just talk about the strategy behind it, and then on Monday I'll talk about more specifically the boycott, why we're doing it, and why we think that this will work. So, a number of things have to come into play when we're thinking about what's happening with colonialism. African people, we have to recognize that the same way that the Jews feel passionate about Israel, we have to feel that same passion about Africa. Now, the Jews, if you follow them, they feel that Israel is their homeland, and that's a whole other debate because, it's a whole other debate that we're not getting into. But let's just talk about from their vantage point. Many of them feel like Israel is our homeland. Because of Israel is our homeland, we have to make sure by all costs that Israel is safe. Because if Israel is not safe, then we won't have a homeland. And even if we want to stay in different parts of the world, if we don't have a homeland, then that's basically a big threat to us. Because if stuff goes down here, we need somewhere to escape to. And some just opt to go there automatically because they feel like that's their home. Now, African people, we have to understand similarly that we are in different countries all over the world. Some of us are in countries that are Black-run governments, such as people who are in the Caribbean. You might have majority Black countries, and you can actually do something with that locality without necessarily going back to Africa if you could liberate your individual island. But regardless of, even if you do have that luxury, you have to understand that as far as how the world sees you, as long as Africa is going to be the slave of the world, and understand that is what Africa is. Africa is where everyone goes to get stuff free, or if not free, really cheap, take it back to their country while they leave Africa poor. As long as Africa is in that position, then as a human being who is of that descent, you are regarded as being for exploitation and being for the use of Western people. So we have to understand that as long as our homeland is oppressed, as long as our homeland is going to be subjugated to exploitation, we are up for grabs. We are up for grabs in America, we're up for grabs in Europe, we're up for grabs everywhere because we don't have a home base, we don't have people who are advocating for us from our home base, and we are seen in a similar light as those who are seen from the home base. Now, understanding that Africa, its position is so important to us no matter where we are in the world, we also have to understand what is Africa's biggest challenges it faces right now. The biggest challenge in Africa is neo-colonialism. Neo-colonialism is essentially what happened whenever the African countries were liberated, as far as the colonialism came to an end. But in place of colonialism came a system called neo-colonialism, where instead of the governments officially being the subjects of European countries. So instead of officially being a colony of France, you were basically a colony of France in that France was taking your resources. They were telling your leaders what to do, but it wasn't written in law. In law, it says that you're independent and that you can do whatever you want. However, in actuality and in practice, that's not what's happening at all. Now, the way that it's carried out oftentimes in Africa, and there's many ways that neo-colonialism does get carried out, it's often carried out where you have these corporations who are partnered with the government. So understand that in America and other Western countries, we are essentially an oligarchy. An oligarchy meaning we are ran by a few individuals, and these individuals are the corporate entities. So others might say it's a corptocracy. A corptocracy. I think I said that right. So basically, the businesses are the ones that's running our country. Similarly, whenever you have people going over to Africa, you'll have these business liaisons going over to Africa, and they're offering them these luxurious contracts and all these things, saying, oh, if you just borrow this much money from us, we'll do this for you, we'll do that for you. It's really detailed in the book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, if you want the full detail. But they'll offer these luxurious, contracts with these leaders, and the leaders are always already picked by the Western governments because they know that they're going to do what they tell them to do. So they offer them these contracts, and the leaders say, oh, okay, and you're going to give me this much money? Oh, okay, cool. So then the corporation goes and does whatever work for the African country. The African country won't be able to pay it back because the contracts are always based off of things that, numbers as far as their economy, that they purposely want to make it so that the African country defaults on their loan to the Western government. So when this happens, what happens next is the people who have to pay back the debt are the African people. The presidents or leaders or whatever, they're making bank off the contract they had with the Western government, but the country now has to pay off a debt of millions, billions of dollars to these to the countries that gave them the contracts. And that's being paid by the people while the leader just enjoys the money that he got from the corporation liaisons. So this has a horrible effect on the country. We have people that are paying debts for contracts and things that they never even had anything to do with. We have children who are starving, picking trash, just living on the street, living in horrible conditions because their leaders decided to make a deal with a foreign government that essentially put their whole country in debt because their leaders were going to be able to live off of the spoils of that contract. So when you understand how horrible this is, and that we can't put a finger on who exactly is doing what because of the way the system works, we really, it's hard to even identify every once in a while. And I posted an article on Pan African News Press as well as on the FAL page. There is sometimes where you can figure out who these corporations are, but overall it's very difficult because everything is confidential. Everything's done in secret. So it's very hard to just figure out who these people are and target them directly. Now, what I want to say next is that understand that these people will violate international law. They'll violate, the countries will allow these people to violate the constitutions, the treaties, the laws, any type of treaty, international law. They will allow you to violate that if you are a corporate entity bringing money into the country. Why will they allow that? Because essentially, if your corporate interests are being escalated, then the country's corporate interests are being escalated for the top 1%, or the top people, period, because it's more than 1% really. So understanding this, understanding that everything is done in secret, understanding that we don't really have people who we can identify and target directly, we have to come to the realization that our only solution to ending neocolonialism is what I'll call economic warfare. We have to declare war on these people as consumers. And not just as consumers, we have to make it so horrible that other consumers are looking at these same people and saying, okay, I don't even want to align myself with them. I think France is a great starting point, not just because of the corruption that's going on with the French government, which is backing the regime in Togo, but France as a colonialist power has done some of the worst things to Africa. And specifically, if we're going to talk about it, understand that France still requires its former colonies to pay taxes to France. Now, you would think that it should be the reverse, because you colonized my land, you took my things, you should be paying me back. You should be giving me reparations. But no, France requires the former colonies of France to pay taxes. Not only that, they require that these countries use francs as a currency. They call them it's an African franc, basically, that they require for them to use. Not only that, but they require that these countries put 65% of their national treasury into French banks. Not only that, but there's so many things. They require that if there's a natural resource in the country, that they have the first rights to that of the Western powers, and the country essentially can't even bargain with other powers as far as how they're going to sell those things. France is the worst colonist, and that was the disgusting thing to me, as far as how people pretend that France is such a human rights haven, as far as how they pretend that they treat African people or treat the world like it's a just place. But in actuality, they're the most brutal, most savage neo-colonialist on the face of this planet. Even the president of France admitted that if without Africa, France, they're out of here, because that's their last crutch, because them having the ability to take the resources from the countries and also require them to pay taxes, that is essentially what is keeping the French economy alive. So, of course, desperate times, desperate measures. They're doing these things out of desperation. However, we are against this being done at the expense of African people and African children who are suffering at the hands of neo-colonialism. So, the last thing I'm going to say about this boycott in Togo for today, and as I said, I'll do a full video on it on Monday, is that the other strategic thing to do, understanding that our goal, and I seen someone, I think it was Dark Africa, who commented on the previous video that I talked about the FAL for. He said that the goal can't just be that we're going to liberate Africa. We also have to have a goal for after that happens. And I completely agree with that. So what I'm thinking in my mind is the ultimate goal is that Africa be developed, and that Africa be able to be self-sustaining, that Africa be able to be one of the ones who are producing in this world and not just being a consumer continent. And in order to do that, we have to replace these products that we're boycotting with African products, in order to simultaneously, while we're liberating Africa from the colonialist powers that are depleting them of their resources, we also have to support African industries, so that when that does happen and when Africa is free of colonialism, that Africa will be able to have its own industries that are fully Black owned and that are humane, its own industries, to essentially supplant them. Because understand what has happened in the past with colonialism is that once the colonialists essentially said that they're leaving, they're saying, okay, well, we're taking everything with us. We're taking all these things we built for you. That's actually how France was able to enforce a lot of the taxes on African nations, because they did all these things in Africa, and they said, well, since we're leaving and we're leaving you with all these things that we did for you, you have to pay us. But the response should be that we already have something developed, we already have something in place to replace the system of exploitation of neo-colonialism. We're fully prepared to be in control of our own destinies. So this was a long video, and I apologize for that. But I hope that you fully grasp the importance of boycotting if you use it. Understand that if you're using boycotting as a reactionary means to something, it's not going to last. However, if you're using boycotting strategically, and if you're convinced and convincing others of the strong importance of this boycott, then you're more than likely to be successful. In the sense of neo-colonialism, the only way, in my personal opinion, that we're ever going to be able to free ourselves of the colonialist powers is that if we do so through economic warfare. And boycotting essentially is our first means to that, I believe. So I will see you on another video. Leave your comments and thoughts